I'm Ed Griffin. I'm an author, researcher. I've written some books. I've written a book most recently of interest called The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve System. And I've written other things on the United Nations called The Fearful Master. I wrote a book on natural cancer research and therapy called World Without Cancer, and topics of that nature which generally are a little bit upstream, and topics which I think are very important. Well, the United Nations is different things to different people. Most people think that the UN is our last best hope for peace. That's the way it was sold to me when I was in school. It was offered as an organization where different nations could come together and work out their problems and their grievances in a peaceful manner, and be a means of reducing world conflict and increasing the economic prosperity of all of the member nations and all of these wonderful things. In reality, it turns out to be none of the above. In reality, the United Nations is the seat of what the member governments hope will become a true world government. It's to be a government. And there's nothing inherently wrong with a world government, but we need to ask the question, what kind of a world government is this going to be? If the United Nations were going to be a government based on all of the things they've said it was going to be, peace and prosperity and protecting individual rights and all of these things, I think it'd be pretty hard to oppose it. But in reality, it's being built as a model of collectivism. The political ideology that is inherent in the United Nations is collectivism. It's a word that probably needs to be defined for our purposes here, but in general, it means a totalitarian system, a system of concentration at the top and the people being at the bottom being ruled from above. Not that the people have any voice in determining the direction of their government or the world, but they are to be told what the direction is, and they're to be told to follow it. Collectivism is a philosophy of big government and small people, and it's a philosophy that supposedly all of this is being done in the name of society. In other words, it's for the greater good of the greater number, supposedly. And so you're supposed to go along with whatever inconvenience or insult to your freedom comes along, because after all, it's in the greater good of the greater number. And this is the rationale being used, has been used for quite some time, to justify all kinds of horrible atrocities. All the leaders have to do is say, well, it's for the greater good of the greater number. That's the philosophy that's built into the United Nations from top to bottom. And so therefore, the answer to the question, what is the United Nations? The United Nations is a budding or building world totalitarian system. The key people behind the United Nations are found in all of the major countries of the world. It was primarily a product of the United States. The United Nations was drafted, the charter was actually written by a small group of people in the United States State Department. This was during World War II that all of this work was being done. And so they were collectivists in the United States State Department. Their goal was world government based on the model of collectivism. The United States has always been the major supporter and financer of the United Nations. So you'd have to say that the key people behind the United Nations are the globalists, I think is the best word to use to describe them, in the United States. Now, who are they? They would be politicians, they would be people in the State Department, they would be international financiers. You must remember, for example, that the land where the United Nations is seated was purchased by the Rockefellers and donated to the United Nations. Well, they didn't do that as a means of being great humanitarians, although that's the image that many people have. They did because they had a keen interest in building this new world order, and they thought this would be the seat for it, and so that's why they did that. So the people behind it in the United States are the international financiers who are located here, primarily the Rockefeller Group, and what's left of the old J.P. Morgan Group, and some of the larger banks. But primarily, you find most of these people in an organization that is not well known, but definitely very important. It's called the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a group in the United States with about 4,000 members at the most. And yet these people, number one, are all dedicated to building a new world order, a global government, based on the model of collectivism. And number two, you find them at the tops of most of the important organizations in this country. You find them in government. About half of our presidents and vice presidents and just about all of our secretaries of state and secretaries of defense and heads of the CIA and the FBI and all of the important positions in government. If you look at who these people are over the years, they're members of this Council on Foreign Relations. Most of the great universities they have as their president or the board of directors dominated members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The news channels, ABC, CBS, NBC, the Turner Broadcasting System, Murdoch. I mean, Murdoch is a well-known member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So all of these major power centers of society are in the hands of this small group, under 4,000 members. And so you ask who's behind it. If you want a list, that's a good place to start. Write to the Council on Foreign Relations office in New York, as I have done every year, and I ask for a membership report or an annual report. And on the back of each report, they proudly list all of their members. So that's where you find who is behind the United Nations. A lot of people believe that, in this country, we're the masters of our own political destiny. We don't have an elite. Maybe we have some rich people. Yes, we have some powerful people. But the idea of an elite or an international elite is foreign to the thinking of a lot of Americans. But the truth is we do have one. And their intention is to, number one, maintain their positions of being the elite, having vast power and control and financial wealth. And number two, to extend it to the international level. We have these international elites, we call them international, but basically they're housed in each nation. We have them in England and France and the United States and Germany and so forth. And now the big move among these people is to coalesce into a true international elite, whereby they will be operating through the governmental power of the United Nations. Now they really have clout, because there's no nation in the world that can escape their power, because the way these people work is that if they want to accomplish something, if they have an agenda, let's just pick one at random, disarmament, or another one, population control, or something like that. As it is now, they have to convince each of the respective nations and their governments to implement those agendas. But once you have a true United Nations with true governmental power, with real military forces, and once you have turned over to these agencies of international power control over your armies and over your air force and over your weapons of mass destruction, you have created a global government which is cannot be challenged by any nation whatsoever. So now these international elites do not have to worry about convincing the governments in each part of the world. As long as they control the center of this power, which is the United Nations, they therefore can control the world. It's a very heady wine, I'm sure, but that's what their objective is. My personal answer is that we should have none, that our obligation is to the American people and to our own interests. Not that we should not be compassionate or interested in the affairs of the world, but we should not have any binding, legal, militarily backed obligation to anybody. It's up to us to determine what we want to do. It's just like I may be concerned over my neighbor's condition. I may want to help him, but I'm not obligated to go and sacrifice my life, let's say, in order to make him do what I think he should do. I shouldn't sacrifice his life to make him do what I think he should do. It should not be coercion involved. But the obligation of the United States to the United Nations on a legal front has become entwined in these things we call treaties. It has been determined by the Supreme Court of the United States that when we enter into a treaty with another nation, that treaty supersedes our own Constitution. And it's an amazing interpretation, but they say if the President and the Senate agree to do something with another country, then that wipes out all of the constitutional requirements and guarantees, and that treaty has the higher obligation. So if you're talking as a globalist or as an internationalist and you want to see the building of this new world order, you would say that our obligation to the United Nations is legal and it's binding because the United Nations has the status of a treaty. And then we have all these sub-treaties that follow along after it, NAFTA and GATT and all of these organizations that are created. Those are all based on treaty agreements. And so piece by piece, they have been weaving this fabric around us, like the little silk threads that the Lilliputians wrapped around Gulliver in Gulliver's Travels. I mean, any one thread you could break, but Gulliver woke up one morning and he had these thousands of little threads around his body, and although he was a giant compared to them, he could not move. They had captured him. So I think that's basically what's going on. And in that sense, we have this obligation to the United Nations because we're being bound down by thousands of treaties, and it's destroying our independence. Well, we can get out of the United Nations the same way we got in, and that is to rescind our treaty. The Senate has the ability to sign onto a treaty. It also has the ability to cancel a treaty if it wishes. It has the backbone to do so. That's how it would be done legally or technically. But before that will happen, we need to create a great groundswell of awakening on the part of the American people to back their senators in such a move. Because right now, if anybody made that recommendation, and there have been a few, the average American says, what's that all about? Why would we want to get out of the United Nations? Isn't that a good organization? You know, that's their thinking. So as long as there's that lack of real information about the United Nations, as long as people are still buying the myth instead of the reality, there's no chance in the world that the Senate is going to do that. So we start down this path with an awakening program. We've got to spread the truth about the United Nations to all of our friends. Some people don't want to be awakened. So I suppose, and I have a few in my acquaintance, they just don't want to hear this because it upsets them. Their nice little world is that everything is fine. We're having problems, yes, but we've got all well-intentioned people as leaders, and there are no hidden agendas, there are no conspiracies out there. Everything is just what it appears to be on the nightly news. And they don't want to hear this thing because that runs contrary to their little worldview. But I think that even those people are susceptible to the truth if they are shown some real hard facts. When I wrote one, in fact, it was my first book so many years ago. It was published in 1964, called The Fearful Master, A Second Look at the United Nations. The first part of the book had to do with the actual history of the United Nations military action in the Katanga, in Katanga province in Africa. And I don't believe anybody can read the details of that. And this, by the way, these details are coming from the people who lived through it, and in many cases, even the United Nations personnel who were involved in it, boasting about what they were doing. Some of these United Nations people, like Connor Cruz O'Brien, who was one of the top leaders of the whole movement there in Katanga, said that, well, of course we lied to the people. That's what we're expected to do. He was very proud about it and very open. He said, we know that the United Nations Charter says we must not intervene in the internal affairs of a nation. He said, but that's silly. Of course, but that's why we were there, is to intervene in the internal affairs of the nation. Of course we lied about it. And so what I'm trying to say is that once a person actually sees real history of this so-called peacekeeping force, which was nothing but an invading army, a United Nations army invading a peaceful province of Katanga, which had no problem of civil unrest. Their economy was functioning. There was chaos going all around it, but did the peacekeepers go into the chaotic areas? No. They went into the peaceful area in order to bring them down and bring them under the blanket of totalitarian control for the whole region. And it's just an amazing story, and you cannot believe it until you actually see it and hear it spoken by the people who participated in it. So what I'm trying to say is that once people begin to understand real history, and really understand what's going on, not just mythological interpretation that you get off of the boob tube, but really get behind the scenes, then I think they'll begin to question that the United Nations maybe isn't all of this apple pie and ice cream that it's supposed to be. Once that happens, perhaps it'll not happen until there are so-called peacekeepers parading the streets of America. I don't know. Maybe then they'll finally get it. But somewhere down the line, Americans will understand that the United Nations is not a peaceful organization, and that the peacekeepers are not there to keep the peace, but to wage war against its enemies. Once they understand that the type of the government being created by the United Nations is totalitarian in nature, once they see that, and they can get past the propaganda and actually see it with real live events, then the game is over. I do know that eventually almost everyone on the planet will understand the deception behind the United Nations. The only question, it's an annoying question, is will it be soon enough to do anything about it? Because once the United Nations grows to the point where it's given a monopoly over all the mass weapons, then who can stand against it? It's just an internationally secure totalitarian system. We've got to break its grip before it reaches that point. Years ago, I used to run into a lot of apathetic people. I don't so much anymore, and the explanation for that may surprise you. It's not that people are much different, it's that I'm different. Here's how that came about. I remember when I was first becoming aware of these events that we're talking about, I was very alarmed, very concerned, and I wanted everyone to hear and to understand. So I would back up the truck to somebody and pull the lever and dump them with all of this newfound knowledge I had, and I'd bury them, scare them to death, and they'd start getting this glazed look in their eye and like, oh, well, I think I better go to my golf game or something. They did not want to hear all this. And I remember saying to myself, how apathetic these people are. Why don't they take an interest? And then one day I realized that I was the problem, much more than they. And I say that because if you have if you're in a life raft in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and forget how you got there, but there you are, you're all alone in this life raft, and you look over the edge and you see little bubbles coming up, and you realize, uh-oh, there's a hole in the life raft. What do? Well, you don't do anything, because there's nothing you can do. You just lie there and sink. You're the picture of apathy. You don't do anything. But now, if you look around the raft and you see there's a little air pump and a place to screw it in, now what do? Well, now you're pumping air back into the raft to overcome the bubbles coming out of the raft, and you're a picture of activism. Now you're activism until the last breath in your body. You might be out there for weeks, but as long as you've got any life, you're Mr. and Mrs. Activism. And the only difference between these two scenarios is that in the first case, there was nothing you could do. But in the second case, there was at least something you could do, and so you were doing it. And then I realized that I did such a wonderful job of convincing people that things were so bad that there was nothing they could do about it. And therefore they became apathetic. But then I resolved from that point forward, I would always try, when I'm talking to somebody, to present at least a vision of something that can be done, and not just say it to make it sound good, but to really have a plan that can be done. And since I adopted that philosophy and that approach, I don't run into apathetic people very often anymore. I think there's a tremendous amount of progress in terms of an awakening of the public. The worse things get, of course, the easier it is to see that you've got a problem. The higher the water rises in the boat, the more obvious it is that that boat is in danger of sinking. But I don't see much progress in terms of actually reversing the trend or getting the water out of the boat. Awareness, yes. Effective action, no. Mainly because people don't know what to do. That's the reason. That's the reason we created Freedom Force International. We know what to do. We know how to reverse this trend. The answer is very simple. It's not to read another book, not to become more informed or hear another speech or just wring your hands and say, well, we ought to do this and we ought to do that. The answer is to reacquire control of the political system that we live in. That can be done relatively simply, much more easy than most people realize. We have to recapture control of the power centers of society. What are they? The power centers. Those are the groups and organizations through which the masses of the people work and move and think and create public policy. We're talking about the political parties. We're talking about the labor unions. We're talking about the educational system. We're talking about the media. There's certain major centers of power in every country. And whoever controls those power centers really controls the nation, and they don't have to have a lot of membership. That's why an organization like the CFR with less than 4,000 members can control the whole country. Why? Because all of those people are not just out there cutting lawns and running some little business, selling camera supplies or something like that. Every one of them have gravitated or tried to gravitate into the tops of the power centers of the nation. And so you find them in the political parties. You find them in the labor unions and the heads of the universities and the media centers. So 4,000 people in the positions of power, in the power centers, the tops of the power center, can literally control the nation. This is what we have to do. We have to retake those power centers away from collectivists, away from the global elitists, and put them in the hands of people with no particular axe to grind, no agenda, except to restore freedom to America. It can be done. Well, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view, I have a very keen sense of humor, and I tend to laugh when things are more serious than the more serious they are, the more I tend to find humor in it. That's kind of a self-survival tactic I've used over the years. At one point when I was much younger, I was very, very serious about all of this. And I still am, by the way. But I didn't laugh. I didn't have release, and I became very ill. And then I figured out what was going on. All of this worry was affecting my health, and my diet wasn't too hot either. And I didn't exercise, and I was smoking a pipe, and I drank a lot of coffee, and all of these things, you know. You have to look after your health. But one of the things I believe is the best thing for your health is to have a sense of humor and do a lot of laughing. So ever since that time, I found humor even in the darkest issues that we're talking about. And I think it's helped me a lot. I'm not an expert on Agenda 21, but I have a pretty good idea of what it is. It's a globalist agenda to build a world government based on the model of collectivism, but using as the engine for motivating it concern over the environment. See, they use different things to scare people into giving up their liberties and to accepting big, powerful government. It does not just the environment. I mean, the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on pornography, whatever it is you're afraid of, they will use it. And that's not to say that you have no reason to be afraid of it, but they will find whatever people are concerned about, and they'll play that up as a point of focus, and they say, so what are we going to do about it? Well, what we need, obviously, is more government to control these things and to intervene, and that means taking away more of your personal liberties. And we say, oh, that's good, but just protect us from these things. So basically, that's the framework into which Agenda 21 fits. It's concern over the global environment, but really it's a blueprint for the development of global management of the environment, meaning global management over industry and people, which means the loss of your freedom. So it fits into the general pattern in that sense. When you live in the big cities, it's easy to become convinced that the world is overpopulated. Certainly the cities are. And a lot of us have this great desire to get out of the cities and into the country and so forth. And we forget that the great, vast surface of the earth is not overpopulated at all. There's practically nobody there. Cities are overpopulated. But nevertheless, the theory is that if we don't put some kind of, notice, if we don't put some kind of control on population, they never assume that that can take care of itself. It's got, we have to do it. We, the wise ones, we, the controllers, we, the elitists, we who have been to school, we who have looked at the statistics, we who are going to run the world, we are going to control population. That's always the implied message there. They say if we don't put a brake on population, well then it's just going to keep growing and growing until finally the planet will be covered with a solid mass of human flesh. Well, I don't believe that at all. I think that's a scare tactic. We know, for example, that in the last 10, 12 years, America and most of the Western advanced countries and some of the European countries with a higher level of education, the population is actually decreasing. And they don't publish that because it doesn't fit the image of this greatly expanding mass of human flesh. But still, in third world countries, it's true. Population is increasing. And even though the population of the United States might be increasing, it's not because of the birth rate. It's because of immigration. But nobody talks about that because it doesn't fit the scare story, you see. So I believe that the human species has the ability to limit its own population without exterminating people, without birth control administered by the state, with coercion, you know. I think when the politicians and the government get into things like this, it's destined to be not only a horrible failure, but a terrible destruction of human dignity and human freedom. So what more can I say on population control? The elitists who want more control over our lives use that, like they use environment and everything else, terrorism, to scare us into giving them more power. Now, in this case, what's the power? Power over who can have children? Wow, what power that is. If they don't like your political views, they could easily say, well, you're not allowed to propagate. If they don't like your race, they could say, well, you're not allowed to propagate. If they don't like your gender even, they could say you're not allowed to populate. They do that in China right now. So all of these things are possible, and they use this fear of overpopulation, in my opinion, based on very faulty science, but they use that as a means of expanding their control and taking away more of our liberties. It's clear that the IPCC report from the United Nations creating this mythological threat of global warming and global environmental destruction because of greenhouse gases and all of this stuff is another example of flawed science, more than flawed science. It's corrupted science being used to justify an agenda for expanded government, in this case, expanded international government. I guess if I were to say a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, if I were to ask the average person of my acquaintance, and many of those people do not agree with my ideological orientation because they don't really have an ideological orientation at all. They're just people you run into, you know, in the restaurants and the bank and so forth. If I were to ask them what they thought about global warming, they'd say, oh, it's terrible, isn't it? I mean, the planet's going to die, isn't it? And we got to do something about it, don't we? And so forth. Now, it's clearly people are saying, well, that's a joke. There's no global warming going on. Just a bunch of politicians trying to dream up some excuse to have global tax, and they got it. Why? Well, because gradually the science, the true science, is leaking out, getting around all of the gatekeepers, and is breaking through the mass media. And also they can look out their window and see that global warming is not happening, but in fact temperatures are going down and globally. Average temperatures are going out and down. And now they realize that global warming is a very real thing, and it's unstoppable, and it happens over and over again throughout the long term of history. Every couple of thousand years there's a cycle of global warming. It's real, but it's not caused by man. And you can look out in the solar system and you see that they've been measuring global warming going up on some of the other planets, Mars and Venus. Well, there are no man-made gases out there. Why? Because of solar flares and solar activities. And the solar activity is a cyclical thing in nature, and every time the flares increase, the whole solar system warms up. And then the flares contract again, and the whole solar system cools down, which is what we're going through now. So people are beginning to get this, but nevertheless, the engine for totalitarian control just moves ahead as though none of this made any difference. Mr. Gore just denies, completely flatly denies. He is the denier. He calls people who reject global warming as the deniers, but he, in fact, and his group who are pushing this myth of global warming, they're the true deniers of reality, and they just keep pushing for more laws, and they want acceptance, international acceptance of their draconian expansion of laws and taxing power now, and taking money from this nation and giving to that nation, all in the name of global warming, which is what they wanted to do anyway, but now this is a good excuse for it. And they just keep going as though this scientific evidence didn't exist. And I wandered a little bit from the main topic here, but to me that is the crucial element to understand, and that is that the people who are pushing for this great growth of government, both nationally and internationally, don't care what the truth is. They do not care what the people believe. They're completely above that now. They say, forget it, we're going to do it anyway, and this is our reason, and the people are standing around saying, wait a minute, I thought we had representative government. And this is the reality. They don't. And this awareness now is, I think, going to be the next truly significant political development in the world, when the people of the world living in what they thought were representative systems suddenly realize that they are not represented. What are they going to do? It's going to be some kind of a great upheaval, I'm afraid. And it remains to be seen what comes out of that. Ellen Carlin's suppressed EPA report fits into the general pattern. Here's a guy who's pretty high up in the Environmental Protection Agency, and he was asked to write a report explaining what his assessment was of global warming and man-made gases, and to make recommendations what to do about it, just more of the same. He was expected to say, yeah, we got this big problem, and therefore we have to have more laws and give more power and more money to government. Well, he didn't. His report was, hey guys, we made a mistake. There's no global warming going on. Whatever global warming was going on was not caused by man's activities. It was caused by natural phenomena. And besides that, the planet is actually cooling now. Well, they didn't want that answer, and so they suppressed it. And they asked him to rewrite it, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. So now he's in big trouble, and I guess he's fighting for his job. The World Health Organization, as an agency of the United Nations, is no different than any other agencies. They're just branches of this thing called the New World Order, to be based on the model of collectivism. And their main agenda, although it sounds like it's humanitarian, is not really to take care of the health of the world, but to establish governmental chains of command and supply and dominance over the entire healthcare system of the world. And they use diseases and and pandemics and whatever else comes along as a means of justifying this great expansion of international governmental power. That's their true agenda. It's not that what they say is wrong, but we must understand what their motive for being there in the first place is. It's really not to improve the health of the world, but to dominate the healthcare system of the world so that it'll give that power to the elitists to run that segment, another segment of our lives. The International Monetary Fund and its sister organization, the World Bank, are both financial institutions which are based upon United Nations authority. It's not clear what the chain of command is. That's something that's always been a kind of a mystery as to do they take orders from anybody, and if so, who? But nevertheless, they're obviously closely associated with the United Nations. And it's a means of channeling money from the member nations who allocate tremendous amounts of money to the IMF. They vote for it, and it gets a little complicated because it doesn't always result in the money moving from, let's say, the United States to the International Monetary Fund. But what it does, certainly, sometimes it does, by the way, but usually it's a issue of assigning credits. The Congress votes, let's say, $100 million to the IMF, and the Federal Reserve then will come in and say, okay, we give you credit, we guarantee this amount of money. So it doesn't necessarily travel immediately to the IMF, but except as a credit. Well, then the IMF will issue loans or grants, and that's when the credit is used, and then the money eventually moves over to the IMF. But the real issue here is not the mechanism or the chain of authority or anything like that. The thing to keep your eye on is that this money is going to third world countries for the most part, or even larger countries that seem to have financial need. I mean, we've given a lot of money to China, we've given it to Russia, and so forth. But the focus usually is on some little country like Zimbabwe that, people are starving. And the idea is that if we do this humanitarian thing and make the money available as a loan to these countries, that somehow this will upgrade the standard of living for those poor people there. And the average American says, well, that's wonderful. They applaud it and think how nice it is that our politicians are so humanitarian that they're voting to give my money to these countries. I approve of that. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't work that way, like so many things in politics. There's the image and then there's the reality, and they're not usually the same at all. The image is one of a great humanitarian effort. The reality is that the money goes to the governments. That means it goes to the dictators in most cases, to the corrupt political elite at the top of those countries, and it goes right to them. And they use the money, first of all, to fatten their own pockets, to pay for their jets and the suites at the Waldorf Astoria and their palaces and their yachts and so forth. That's where it goes first. Then the second line is to go to support all of their cronies, their political support mechanism, and then to support their military that they need in order to hold the population in line. And if there's anything that is left to trickle over, it might go to some of the people, but very little of that, and certainly won't go to any of the people in their countries who are considered to be dissidents, who do not support the regime. So the money doesn't go to help the people at all. All it does is to strengthen the dictatorial regime that has ruined the country in the first place. Now, the dictators, or let's use a kinder word, the leaders of these countries who are getting all this great amount of money from the IMF, they spend it right away, and of course then they need more the next year. And they become dependent on this. It's like international welfare scheme. We have poor welfare families in America where we're into second and third generation of people who've never experienced anything other than welfare. They don't know how to make a living. They think that society owes them this money, and that's their mindset. And I feel so sorry for them because they don't have any vision of becoming independent anymore. And so they're completely dependent on welfare. And therefore they'll always vote for the the politician who promises them to keep their welfare coming, and they become a dependable source of support for the politicians who promise them this giveaway. Well, at the international scene, the same thing happens. These leaders of these countries now have no idea how to make their country independently successful. They don't know how to have a real economy with a productive base. They don't know anything about agriculture or production. It's all international welfare. And so now they're bought. As long as the money comes from the United Nations, these guys are in their pocket. They don't care as long as they get the money. So all of a sudden we realize that through this mechanism, these countries are no longer really independent countries anymore, because their leadership has been purchased by this international welfare, and now they're totally subservient to the hidden, unknown names, faces in the International Monetary Fund that keeps supplying the hundreds of millions of dollars to them. And so they are in line with international policies. They will never step out of line. They can always be depended upon to support the UN's policies. Otherwise, they lose their money. My opinion of the Obama administration is that it's doing exactly what I expected it to do. I'm not surprised. Of course, I'm disappointed because I see it as another example of this great difference between the image and the reality. When Mr. Obama was running for office, he and the media helped to create this image that he was going to bring about change. And there was certainly a lot of need for change. But when he was elected, of course, there was no substantial change except to make everything worse. Everything that Bush was doing that was terrible, Obama continued, only pumped it up a little bit. So that was the change. It turned out it wasn't a change of direction, it was a change of speed in the same direction. And so I'm not surprised. Earlier I mentioned this organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. You'll find that the candidates and the leaders of both Republican and Democrat Party are totally dominated by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. That is the group that determines the policies, foreign policy, domestic economic policies of the United States. And they are the ones who select the candidates. There is no candidate, in my view, that will be nominated for the Republican or the Democratic Party presidential frontrunner unless he has passed the test of the Council on Foreign Relations. All of the candidates, for as long as I can remember, for president, always appear before meetings of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they are grilled, and they're asked questions about what would you do in this case, what would you do in that case. They want to know what they think. And if they do not agree with the policies of the Council on Foreign Relations, they get a thumbs down. Mr. Obama was invited to speak before the Council on Foreign Relations, and they liked everything he said. And they knew that once he was elected, he would continue the same foreign policy, that he would continue the wars in the Middle East, that he would continue to support the financial institutions, that he would continue to take money from the taxpayers and give it to the banks and the insurance companies and support the crony system and keep the system going. They knew that, although the voter had no idea of that. The voter really thought that this guy, because he was sort of on the socialist side, seemed to be on the left and all of that, so surely he would change directions. But out of this now comes the great awakening, which is that in the reality of politics today, there is no difference between the Republican and the Democrat Party, no significant difference. And deeper than that, there's no significant difference between right wing and left wing. The right wing and the left wing are merely two wings on the same ugly bird called collectivism. If you analyze the political ideology of right-wing regimes like Nazism, fascism, and so forth, and compare that to the ideology of left-wing regimes like communism or socialism, you will be hard-pressed to find any difference between them. Different slogans, yes. Under communism, there's class warfare. You hate there's a conflict between the working class and the management class, supposedly. But under under fascism, the hatred is racial in some cases, but there's hatred in both cases, that they use some kind of hatred to whip up emotional support for the voters who are expected to stop thinking when they have a dreaded enemy before them. And they all believe in the principles of collectivism, the primary one being that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. That's one of the primary tenets of collectivism. They both adopt that in spades. And on down the line, all of the major elements of collectivism, as to the origin of rights, for example, the collectivists all agree that rights are issued by the state. Well, of course, if the state issues rights, then the state can take them away, right? And that's what happens under collectivism. Whereas individualists, who are the opposite of collectivists, would say, no, the state doesn't grant rights. The state is there for the purpose of protecting rights, but not to grant them. And there's some fundamental differences. You go down the line, and in every case, the right wing and the left wing are in total agreement. And that's the reason we can go from left to right in American politics and nothing really changes except the rhetoric. Back in 2002, I decided that we needed to do something about this. It wasn't just good enough to know about what's going on in the world or to complain about it and do more research and listen to speakers at conferences and the old, eat, meet, and retreat philosophy that we followed for so many years. A lot of patriotic organizations have wonderful banquets and good speakers, but nothing really changed. And I realized finally the reason nothing really changed is because we didn't have power. We, and I say we, those of us who wanted individual liberty and freedom and did not like this big government Goliath that was being created around us, we had a mindset which is, no, we don't want to have power ourselves. That's the problem. I mean, we don't want to control people's lives. So we backed out of politics. We wouldn't go into organizational work. So politics, no, I hate politicians. It's all dirty work and so forth. And we just backed away and let the collectivists who love that kind of work take over. And it suddenly dawned on me, that's why we're losing. We didn't have the power. So I created an organization called Freedom Force International. And the primary thing that makes that different, well, one of the two primary things, is that its goal is not just to educate, but to come back into power, to take the governmental power of our system and put it back into the hands of people who have no agenda except the preservation of their liberties. And there's a way to do that. And Freedom Force International is dedicated to that structure and creating that international network. It's beginning to happen already. We have been getting some powerful reports from our people out in the field saying that they've been successful in running for central committee in the political party of their choice. They're running for office. Some of them are getting elected to office and so forth. It's a slow beginning, but this is a new thought for freedom-loving people. It's not a new thought for those who want to control our lives, but those who want to be left alone have never wanted to do that before. So this is beginning to happen. This is basically what Freedom Force International is all about. I said there were two things that made it different. The other thing is that we have a creed. We know what we believe in. It's not just what we're against, but we also know what we believe in. Because I think that if we don't have our own agenda, positive agenda, we cannot build a better world. And history is so full of examples of people who have been downtrodden, and then when they can't take it anymore, they've risen up, and at great cost in blood and treasure, they may have been able to overthrow some tyrannical regime, and then they wake up and find out that a year or two later, they've replaced it with one just as bad. And we've seen that happen, of course, in American politics, where we rise up against something we despise, but then, oops, we got one just like it. And the reason for that is because while it's easy to know what we don't want and what we don't like, it's not so easy to know what we do want, what we do like. And so we felt it was necessary to create what we call the Creed of Freedom. And this is a statement of political philosophy. It's a very short statement. It's written, printed on one piece of paper, and it simply spells out what we believe and what we think is the proper basis for a true system for the state to be. We call it a protectorate, not a government, but a protectorate. A government is supposed to govern, right? The very word is a curve in the track right there. If we say we want to limit our government, which is the way we used to say it, we want limited government, we've already lost the debate, because what we're really saying is that we want to be governed, but in a limited way. We want limited control over our lives. However, if we just change words, it'll cause a different thinking. So we want a protectorate. We don't want this state to govern us. What we want it to do is to protect us, to protect our lives, liberty, and property. Nothing more. Now we call that a protectorate, and we get rid of this word called government, and it causes us to think of the true purpose of this thing we call the state. And so that's an important part also. We have a creed, we know what we believe in, and we put those two things together. We've got a positive view of a better way, and we have a mechanism for infiltrating, and that's the word the enemy uses, infiltrating. I don't like it, but going into organizations that we should have been into all along. We should have been in politics. We should have been on the school boards. We should have been in the city councils. We should have been in all these places. Go back into those areas and take them back. That's what the mission of Freedom Force International is all about.